Hello, and welcome to the first episode of our Fall 2020 Learning to Listen Conversations for Change webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us today. Already can see in the chat that folks are coming from all over the country, home visitors, people in early childhood education, and not sure where some of you are from, let us know. My name is Joshua Sparrow, and I'm Executive Director of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center. And on our website, brazeltontouchpoints.org, you can find a lot more. You'll see webinar series on family engagement, mental health for all of us during COVID-19 times, and many others, including upcoming conversations for change. So just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on the webinars tab you'll find there. We are so fortunate to have our featured speakers, transgender experts Johanna Olson-Kennedy and Aydin Olson-Kennedy, with us here today to answer your questions following the premiere of the conversation we recorded together back in January before the pandemic hit. So be sure to put your questions in the question answer box. Before we start, I did want to get to a couple of housekeeping and technical details. Most of you know the drill already, but here we go. First, we've had almost 2,000 people. Actually, I think we hit 2,000 people to register for today's webinar, which is amazing. So that might mean you might have trouble difficulting the webinar in Zoom. So if you do, you can watch it live on our Facebook page. Just search for the Brazelton Touchpoint Center in Facebook, and then the live stream video will be pinned to the top of our page. Also, for today's webinar, we have Spanish translation by our superb interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, who is joining us all the way from Bogota, Colombia. Thank you, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen. Then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español e inglés. En los controles de su reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo el español, haga clic en Silenciar Audio Original. Today's webinar includes a chat box and, as I mentioned, the Q&A box. So use the chat feature if you have a comment to share or need help with a technical issue. And be sure to choose all panelists and attendees if you'd like everybody to see your comment. If you have a specific question for Johanna and Aiden, please use the Q&A box. And we'll be answering your questions starting at about 3:45 Eastern time, maybe a little bit before 12:45 Pacific time, right after our conversation, which runs about 40 minutes. Later today or tomorrow, you'll receive a thank you email with a link to a recording of today's webinar and a link to our feedback survey. And you can also access this recording on our YouTube channel and our website. Please do complete the feedback survey so that we can send you a certificate of attendance. People are always asking for those. And listen, if you have any technical problems, email Kayla Savelli. You'll see Kayla Savelli's email address posted in the chat. So now, before we begin, I want to be sure to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, our BTC production team, Kayla Savelli, Ashley Gaddis, and Michael Accardi, and our friends at Santa Monica Studios, where this conversation was filmed and edited. And of course, I want to thank our experts for the fascinating conversation we're about to watch and who are joining us today to answer your questions. Thank you so much, Johanna Olson-Kennedy and Aydin Olson-Kennedy, for helping so many children and families to be good with just being who they really are, and for the conversation we're about to see, and again, for joining us today. You'll all find out more about Johanna and Aydin in just a moment, so let's get going.
Learning to Listen, TV show and podcast series, Conversations for Change, presented by the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, hosted by Joshua Sparrow. Dr. Sparrow is a child psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, the author of 9 parenting books, and is the executive director of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center. The center was founded by T. Barry Brazelton, who was one of the most influential doctors in pediatrics and child development of the 20th century. Conversations for Change. opening your eyes for new voices on parenting.
This is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. I'm Joshua Sparrow from the Brazelton Touchpoints Center, and in this episode we have Jo and Aydin Olson-Kennedy.
Johanna Olson-Kennedy is the medical director of the Center for Trans Youth Children's Hospital, the largest trans youth clinic in the country. She is also an associate professor at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. Additionally, Dr. Olson-Kennedy spearheads a rigorous research program aimed at better understanding the experience of gender dysmorphia from early childhood through adulthood. Johanna has been providing gender-affirming services for children and adolescents for 14 years and speaks around the world about the importance of appropriate care for transgender youth. Aydin Olson-Kennedy is a licensed clinical social worker who co-founded the Stonewall Alliance Center Community Counseling Program that aims to provide high-quality, no-cost mental health services for LGBTQ youth and adults. He has also created the Transgender Medical Health Program for St. John's. Over the past decade, Aydin's career has focused on providing services for youth and adults within the trans community and their families. Aydin brings a unique perspective to his career as a transgender man who at one time needed similar mental and medical health services for himself.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jo and Aydin. I'd like to start by just learning about the work that you do. Maybe, Jo, you can tell us about your work.
Sure. Thanks for having us. I am the medical director of the Center for Trans Youth Health and Development that is at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I am a USC faculty member, but I'm a full-time practicing physician in the center. I've been doing this work for about 14 years now, and exclusively gender work for about 12.
And how about you, Aydin?
I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have sort of two prongs to what I do. I'm the executive director of the Los Angeles Gender Center, which we are an organization that provides mental health to trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people and their families. And then I maintain my own private practice of working with the same community.
So tell us about you. Why do you do what you do? How did you get involved in this?
Yeah, so I think that that is a complex question with multiple layers. I think that the short and probably most digestible answer is I'm trans as well. And when I transitioned many years ago, there was just sort of this calling to continue to have these conversations and engage professionals and parents and community in meaningful ways that I felt like I could do guided by my education. Prior to my own transition, it was just really clear that I wanted to be engaged in meaningful conversations regardless of the specific topics. So my transition kind of funneled me in, if you will.
And how about you, Jo? Why are you doing what you do?
I did my adolescent medicine training at Children's Hospital Los Angeles in the Division of Adolescent Medicine, where my boss had been doing trans youth care for probably about 5 years when I started my training. So we were one of the oldest and first clinics doing this work in the United States. When I came on as a full-time faculty member, it coincided with the Dutch publishing the Dutch protocol, which included the use of puberty blockers. And it was instantly clear to me that not only did this work need to live in the domain of pediatrics at that point, because we were now talking about engaging people at earlier ages, but that this was an incredible kind of a congregation of science and human rights and social justice and medicine and education that really was a remarkable thing to take part in. And I think that it was academic and social justice curiosity and importance, but then when I started working with trans youth, I knew that I would never do anything else. I'm really moved by young people who are really chasing authenticity in a way that very, very few human beings are.
Can you say a little bit more about a moment or some moments with those kids that made you feel like this is what I got to be doing?
I am struck over and over and over again when young people come in with such incredible clarity about their selfhood, but their clarity has not been allowed to blossom, and it hasn't been nurtured and watered, and oftentimes it's been defied and denied and mocked and ridiculed. And young people continue to push forward, and they continue to assert who they know themselves to be, despite an alarming amount of things that might be happening in their world. But the moment when someone is engaging in a conversation with me and they're being heard for the first time without having to go through this process of convincing me or, making sure that I'm okay, just having an honest conversation about their journey and how they landed there, the relief that they experience, and then when they start moving forward in whatever that way that means to them, just the overwhelming joy. It's very similar to being present at a birth. It really is. And I've thought about this a lot. Like, I want pictures of all my patients, like OBs have pictures of all their patients, but it's a profound, many profound moments.
So I want to ask you, Joe, about how you learned to have that kind of conversation. And then I want to turn to you, Aiden, to ask about how do you help other people learn how to have that kind of affirming conversation? But who were your teachers, or how did you teach yourself?
I don't think I've ever struggled having conversations with people about difficult things. I think in the world of adolescent medicine, particularly, where we are trained in the course of our subspecialty training to talk about things that other people historically find difficult. So I don't think you pursue the field of adolescent medicine unless you want to talk about sex and drugs a lot and you feel totally comfortable in that area. Talking about gender is I think less difficult for me sometimes than it is for young people, because it hasn't felt safe for a lot of people for a long time. So it's getting people to understand that you are there to listen. You're there to listen. And that's very rare, A, for adults, and B, for doctors. So I think that can set the stage in a way that helps people feel more comfortable.
So how do you help other people who may not just be that way? Or can you?
I remember the moment that was really crystallizing for me in wanting to do this work was, before Joe and I were married, Joe was very much my mentor, because she had been doing this work and on a national platform for quite some time, and I was watching her on TV and such. And I was early in my career, and I was still considered an intern, and I was working with this young, up in Northern California, this young transmasculine guy who was assigned female at birth but identified as male, and really needed to move forward in his transition, and his dad was really oppositional, and I was very worried about this young person's well-being, and I was fearful that he would fall over into those sort of scary statistics and categories that we talk about that I think elicit fear and don't always elicit movement. But I was legitimately concerned about his well-being, and I remember having a conversation with Joe around, like, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, and her mentoring me and telling me not what to say, but to remember that out of the three of us in that room, myself, my client, and this client's father, the only person who knew more than me was my client, and that I knew more than this father did. And that part of doing this work and part of doing it with integrity and doing it well is sort of trusting and remembering that, that we are the holders of information that parents often can't get from their children. And if we can bridge that gap between what we know because their children are telling us and maintain that privacy and that confidentiality with that child, but be a conduit to help sort of fill those gaps for parents and do it with a sense of certainty and a certain sense of confidence, and step into being a professional. Because when people go to therapy, they assume they're engaging with a professional. That's the assumption. And so part of doing this work is stepping into your own professional capacity.
So what kinds of information does the child hold, and maybe you do or don't hold, that the parent doesn't have access to? And how do you move that information to the parent in a way that the parent can hold it?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say that almost everything the parent doesn't really know as it relates to their kid's gender and gender process.
So what do you actually do to move the information that you have and that the child has even more of to the parent who doesn't have it, may have a hard time being open to it? What do you do to make that happen?
There's a couple different ways. that plays out. Some of that depends upon what my client's desire is as far as the information that they would like their parents to know, what they don't want them to know. I mean, my obligation is to my clients, not to the parent, right? And so through conversation and consent, sort of getting clarification of what does my client feel like could be helpful if their parents knew that they feel right now they're unable to communicate with clarity or even unclearly, right? And so once we tease all that stuff out, I am out as a trans person professionally. And so my clients know that, my clients' parents know that, and what that advantage gives me is that I can position myself in such a way that I can resonate with some of the things that my clients are talking about in the context of my own experience, but I can also, as an adult, resonate in the ways of sometimes what kids are talking about, they don't land in a way that has the clarity for parents, particularly around a topic that parents want a lot of rigidity around, and gender is not rigid, and so there's an opposition there. But so what I will, with or without the young person in the room, which they always control that also, is have a conversation with the parents of saying, my sense is that there are things going on and things that have been going on for your young person, the person that you love, that maybe you don't know about. And it might be helpful if you had some of that information. I'm wondering if you're willing to participate in a process in which I can transfer some of that information from your young person to you, because you all are in a bit of a gap and we got to close the gap because it's in the best interest of both of you to have that gap closed a bit, right? And then I can talk about the things that as a trans person, thematically, there are themes that is true of trans people. Across the board, there's just themes. And those themes sort of trickle down individually based on people's specific life circumstances and environment and such. But there are themes that are easily identifiable by anyone who does this work.
So Joe, can you tell us what some of those themes are?
Yeah, and I tell my families and patients this too, that I think about this and say this every time someone comes in with a new family. I say, you have one trans kid, right? I have 1,000. Over the course of my career, I have sat in this room and had these conversations so many times. And so I have the advantage of understanding that, part of what you're going to tell me, some of what you're going to tell me, all of what you're going to tell me, I've probably heard before. And so there are, things that are through lines for all of the stories. And after I had seen probably 350 or 400 young people and their families, I started to recognize this is a cohort of people, right? There's folks who their story starts when they're 3 or 4 and they have specific things happening in their life that allow them to talk about their gender, show their gender. And then there's other people who that's not the case for, and their dysphoria or distress around their gender comes at puberty. And there's some people that it's later. But what is true across the board is that young people quickly learn that their experience of their gender is bothersome for other people. It's hurtful for other people. It causes a lot of disruption. And so there is a huge proclivity to not share the level of distress that people are experiencing. So I will ask the young person, are you comfortable talking about your gender journey with your parent or your parents in the room? And if they are, then that young person can talk to me and tell me things, and their parent can witness it. And it doesn't require them to tell their parent specifically, and I can probe about things like, what does it feel like for you when you're called your birth name? How does it land for you when somebody uses this pronoun versus this pronoun, right? And so that's not maybe a conversation a parent would ever think to have.
But they're in it as a listener with you and the child. And
it's also really important for anyone doing this work as a professional to model the way that we want parents to be communicating with children, using the name that most correctly reflects that human and using the pronouns that correctly reflect them, and looping back and asking more than one time over the course of the time they're with you and under care. And that's really, if a parent will witness that and participate in it in session, they're more likely to do it at home but they can watch you do it in a way that is helpful for them.
I think also being a mediator sometimes can be really helpful. I was thinking that in families where there's two parents in the home, that sometimes a young person will be engaging in a conversation with parent A, and there might be some friction or some intense communication happening, and parent B can sometimes be like, okay, let's take a break, right? Like that's not an uncommon role where a third party sort of comes in and like, okay, let's slow everything down a bit. And as a therapist, and probably maybe sometimes you as well in your practice, is that as somebody who's in the room, there's two things that happen. Both parties tend to behave differently when there's an outsider in the inside space, but also as feelings arise and as people start feeling invalidated and not heard, I can say, okay, let's slow down a little bit, right? Let's re-engage in empathic listening and empathic communication. Let's re-engage in some intention around what we're trying to do here. And so like just being able to be that person who is holding multiple roles, right? Because as a physician, many of the roles that you hold is not the medicine piece, right?
That's absolutely true.
You hold the medicine piece, but you're also doing a tremendous amount of psychosocial, behavioral health sort of piece around young people and parents. And the inverse is true for me. I'm doing all the psychosocial and mental health, but I'm also sometimes somebody who's talking about medical stuff, encouraging parents to meet with a medical provider to get more information. And so you're playing multiple roles when you're doing this work.
Yeah, I have a great example of this. So I saw a young person very recently in my practice, and she is ramping up towards starting puberty blockers, which for her is going to be a little tiny implant placed in her arm to just pause her puberty for a little while, so she can, have conversations about how she wants her gender to look and lots of different things. This is a kid who's been asserting a female gender for a very long time.
Since 3 or 4 or 5.
Yeah, really young childhood. I think she's 11 or something right now. But she was experiencing, as I was talking about how the blocker is put in and the process, and they're gonna numb your arm up, and then they're gonna make a little incision, and then they're gonna put it in, and I could feel that her anxiety was ramping up, not because she didn't want her puberty suspended, but because she didn't want to go through this procedure. It scared her. And she was making like, like hissing kind of at her parents, and like we do this as parents. We try to talk our kids out of their feelings, right? Like we're not
instead of validating
Yes,
them.
We're not doing it to invalidate them, but we're also not holding them, right? And so I said, I'm wondering if that sound you made is, I don't feel like you're hearing my anxiety about this. And she said, oh yeah, that's what it is. And then we were able to move on and really get to the conversation about what this would really look like why we wouldn't put you to sleep for this, why we would do local numbing so that you didn't feel it. And so we could really then talk through the information because validate it. Oh yeah, that I imagine that seems really scary to you.
So let's stop for a moment and turn to our audience. We've got a couple of questions.
What advice would you like to give parents whose children have been struggling with their gender identity?
I think the greatest thing that we can do for our children around anything that our children are starting to explore, talk about, or think about is to listen, is to ask them questions in a way that leaves the conversation open for them and leaves an open door. It's really important when young people are beginning to talk about this, if they start to talk about it, that we leave our own thoughts and perceptions at the door and be available just to hear what young people are saying.
So that sounds like it may be a hard thing to do. And I'm wondering if you could talk about like how you help parents work towards being able to do that.
If parents are in a space or an opportunity to connect with other parents, I think that's really valuable, because asking somebody to suspend their own ideas and needs and perceptions indefinitely is not realistic. And in fact, asking somebody to suspend their feelings and emotions for 5 seconds sometimes is not realistic. And so, yeah, which I'm sure you'll see soon. So figuring out ways for that parent who probably in that moment or those moments may feel unequipped to respond to their child, and maybe even fearful that they're going to say or do something that is going to be harmful on one end, or the underlying fear that just is not based in any reality at all, but it's a fear nonetheless, is that they're going to say or do something that's going to influence their child. And so parents often sort of like freeze, right? And when people freeze, it's left up to interpretation of what that freezing means. And young kids who are talking about their gender, part of the job of understanding how to navigate the world as a trans person is that you're in constant interpreting people's behavior, what they're saying, what they're not saying. It's a full-time job. And so silence can mean a million things. So as somebody who is a big advocate for parents, and is that parent engaging in a space with other parents so that he or she or they can sit in a room outside of their child's ears and say, oh my gosh, I'm terrified. Oh my gosh, right? And roll through all of the things that parents have to roll through in order to arrive at a different place. Also turns out to be true for everyone with everything. That they can then come back and be present with their child and sort of resuspend for a few minutes and be present and then like go back and engage. And a lot of times, you know, a little bit for older kids, they will disclose or talk about their gender to one parent, but then require that parent to not tell co-parents. That happens all the time.
That's a problem.
And in a heterosexual family, frequently kids will disclose to mom and tell mom that they are not allowed to tell dad. And not only not allowed to tell dad, but they're not allowed to tell dad for a long period of time, which is not uncommon. And so what then that happens is that it's further isolation for that parent, because her primary person, that is co-parenting, but her primary communication person is off limits in this topic, right? Because if she betrays her child's trust and confidence, there's repercussions for that. But if she doesn't, then she's left holding that, right? And so, you know, when I get contacted either in my private practice or at the Gender Center, I get these calls all the time. I get this call of my kid just told me, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I have no idea where to go, but I really don't want to mess it up. Like those words exactly, I receive 3 or 4 times a week in phone calls.
So when that happens, when the child tells one parent, usually the mother, and forbids that parent from telling the other, if you get a chance, if you're there, what do you say to the child? What do you say to the parent who knows?
I think, let me go back to the last thing and say, maybe it's not about suspending your feelings, but it might be about suspending your words, maybe changing your output circuit a little bit so that your first response doesn't spill out onto your child.
Be a receiver in that moment as opposed to a giver.
Yes, and that's really important because, you know, every person that I work with has that first reaction from the first parent they told seared into their brain. Seared into their brain. And it's impossible to walk back for the parent, even if they feel horrible about it in that moment or at a later time. So that's why I say maybe just don't sort of spill out your first reaction of fear or anger or whatever that is. If it's, this is amazing, I'm so glad you're sharing this with me, that's a great thing to spill out. But if it's not that, maybe don't spill it out right in that moment. So that's really important.
I think that when I know that a circumstances that one parent knows and one parent is forbidden to know, I think that the inclination is to tend to and nurture the co-parent relationship. And in this circumstance, I disagree with that entirely. I think that it is of utmost importance that the confidence of that child is maintained. That parent, when that parent comes to know what's going on, that parent can then have a place to process their feelings about not knowing, right? But what happens a lot is that, and you know, I think I spoke about this when we were talking earlier, is that we have a proclivity to take care of the wrong people in these conversations. We have a proclivity to take care of the parents, the grandparents, the siblings, the aunts, the uncles, the teachers. We have a proclivity to sort of take care of the adults, not because we knowingly don't want to take care of the young person, but frequently adults are better equipped to talk about what they need and their process, and sometimes feel more comfortable taking up that space. And sometimes young people are more willing to sort of take a step back, and so there's a perception that they have different needs. And I think that elevating and saying part of the deal about being an adult, for the most part, is that you have some tools in your toolbox that maybe your little one doesn't yet have. And so we got to rally around your little one, and your adult feelings. They're important, and they need to have space, and they need to be validated, but not at the expense of your child's. And so that's a really important piece, is that helping that young person identify and clarify, if possible, with parent who does know, what is it about co-parents, this in a heterosexual family, what is it about dad knowing that feels so scary for you? What is your fear about that? Is there something that, can we whittle this down, not to 4 or 5 things, but if you were gonna say, like, what's your number one fear, what is that, right? And if we can identify that, and we can parse out what's story, what's fact and what's fiction. We can talk about, like, this will factually happen, and this is my fear of what's happening, right? And we can further whittle that down. We can actually get that young person to a place where they have what they need inside of themselves to communicate to co-parent, rather than that confidence being broken and mom going behind kid's back, because there's damage that happens in that trust in that relationship when that pathway happens.
So what are the kinds of specific fears that kids will tell you about when you ask them what's the worst thing that could happen if dad finds out?
I mean, I think that the very worst one is some form of, he won't love me.
Rejection.
Yeah. I'll be a disappointment. He'll be embarrassed. He will shame me. Kids don't usually use language such as shame, but like as an adult, and what I hear kids talk about, it's like, it's rejection, it's fear, it's shame. I don't want my dad to be mad at me. My dad will yell at me. Those really foundational things that kids are fearful of their parents doing, right? That our first sense of being important and valuable and meaningful as just a human in our world comes from our parental interactions. And so if very early on, accidentally or sometimes intentionally, those messages are that who you are is not okay for me, who you are is a disruption to who I am in my world and my life, like that integrates into that young person's sense of self, and that takes years. If that happens over and over, it takes years and sometimes a lifetime to unpack some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who have, young people will often go on fishing expeditions with their parents to kind of put out feelers and what's going to be the reaction to that, or we're watching something on the news about trans folks or like trans people in the military or whatever, and I'm watching how my parents are seeing that information as data for me. And so if you have seen your parent participate in a way that is scary or non-affirming, that can start you down that road, even if that's not actually how your parent's going to respond. I mean, I've had young people who are like, I can't tell my dad, he's gonna be mad at me, they're gonna kick me out. There's some people who have had experiences of physical violence in their house, and like, this is gonna be bad for me, it'll be bad for my sibling, it'll be bad for my mom. It's just very disruptive. So there's a lot of information that young people have already gathered, but sometimes there's an overestimation of maybe the negative response. And so it is about like, okay, let's talk about fact and fiction, and I'm not gonna tell your dad, like that's not my role. But it's also really important, if people are going to move forward with seeking medical care, that there are legal requirements for parents to consent to care. So talking about what's the pragmatic piece of this versus the other pieces. And then a lot of times it's about, do you think it would be easier if we were all in the room together, right? And that there was some kind of mediation of that conversation, or maybe I could say something to your dad, or do you want me to call your dad? So working through that, and it usually, it's an interesting thing when I think about, sometimes parents will say, well, you got to tell your grandparents then, and I think about this, like, what other space in medicine are we like okay, 11-year-old, get on the horn and tell your grandma you got leukemia. Like, what? We don't do that. That's weird, right? But I think that there's a sort of litmus test that parents want sometimes their kids. Like, oh, I've heard parents say this, if you're willing to, you got to be willing to give blood for blood tests if you're going to go through this. Like, that's a marker of how serious you are, right? And it just sort of negates that person's experience or fear of needles or, just fear of medicalization. So, a lot of this is just sort of sleuthing and understanding where young people are at and then understanding where their parents are at too.
I just want to add that there may be parents who are watching this who have trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary kids, and as we're talking, they may recognize the things that they did or said in what Joe and I were talking about right now of like, this could be problematic or this could be harmful. And I want to sort of close that loop, if I can, that we know these things because they are the most common things that happen, right? But you can actually go back and do some repair work. You actually can do that. And most of the time, I think that there are rare circumstances that this is changing now as this conversation becomes more and more common. But most of the time, a parent's first reaction is not going to be what that young person would script if they could. That's just realistic. And so there comes a time when a parent with the right support and the right information can continue to move in their journey and arrive at a place that is different than where they started when their kid first told them. And it is at that point where that parent can recognize of like, I am no longer there, that there is a calling that is an opportunity to go back to that young person and say, I realize I am not there any longer. I now know things that I did not know then. And I also know that I said some things that I would not say today. And I just want you to know that I'm taking accountability for those things. I wish that I have not done those things, and I will not do those things in the future. And I think that's a really important piece because that loop often doesn't get closed for that young person. And I learned this from one of my mentors, Susan Landon, is that we sometimes want to take responsibility by saying sorry, by apologizing. And I think that there's value in apologizing, but I think in this context, I don't think there's a role for an apology. I think there's a role for accountability. And there's a huge difference between saying, I'm sorry, because we compel people, particularly young people, to say it's okay.
Yeah,
That's
not their job.
It gives us a pass of our behavior. When we say, I regret, I wish I would not have, I will not do it again, that responsibility never gets shifted onto the young person. The parent or the adult or the partner, whoever it is maintaining the accountability and responsibility for their behavior the entire time. And so if parents are like, oh my gosh, everything they just said, or one of those things they just said, I did to my kid, and now my kid is going to be forever damaged and never coming back. I think that you can sort of take a moment of recognizing like that was not my best moment as a parent, which we all have, right? And you can go back and say, hey, so that was not my best moment, and I just want to acknowledge and take accountability for that. It's not going to erase the things that were said or done, but it can certainly repair a fracture, and that's really important. And it's important to feel empowered in this process.
And is there something to say then to validate or acknowledge the hurt that was caused by what the parent had done before moving forward on his or her road?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's always... I think that is humans, but we'll sort of keep it in this context, that when we recognize that we have said or done something that has been harmful or painful to somebody, we can kind of get caught up in intention. That's not what I meant to do. And when we get caught up in intention or what our intent was, we are just protecting ourselves. And so not getting lost in the intention conversation, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean, now we're just talking about our feelings. And it's really important that we continue to sort of focus on. And so I recognize, that what I said, I didn't know at the time, but I recognize now that that was really painful. It was really invalidating. And my fear is not an excuse, right? So you can still put these places of like, this is what was going on for me and these were my feelings, because people have to have feelings in an exchange. Even when you're talking with a 6-year-old, right? You're using different language, but the goal and the way that you're doing it is the exact same. I'm an adult and I did this and it was hard for you and hurt for you, and so I want to acknowledge that and I want you to know that I won't do that again. And so people are like, well, I'm not going to talk to my 6-year-old like that. And I'm like, well, maybe you could. actually have that conversation with your 6-year-old, so you're not having it when they're 16 and they're telling you about it, how they felt for the last 10 years.
You know, there are a number of the things that you've both said that I think apply to challenging conversations of all kinds, about all kinds of things, between parents and parents and children. And it makes me think that one of the challenges is that the gender challenge can kind of take up all of the energy and attract all of the focus and leave out a lot of the whole person. And so I'm wondering if you see that in some of the work that you do and how you help the child and the parent open up space so that they can be whole with themselves and with each other.
I think that it's probable that we see people in the period of time that is the most chaotic. And so as people, certainly as a medical provider, I'm seeing people as they're, you know, getting to the point where they want to start medical intervention. Most people are not coming in for puberty blockers. They're not coming in at 5. The majority, the average age of seeking services is about 15 or 16, which is a really rough time anyway. And so, you know, and someone coming in at 15 or 16 has likely had chaos related to their gender distress prior to you seeing them, but certainly as they're ramping up to either the parent is just doesn't know what else to do, or the young person has finally done a lot of work to land in my clinic, they're going to embark on changing around their hormone milieu, right? So if you're 15 or 16, you're likely going to go through a second puberty. And at least it's the puberty you want, so that's bonus, but that's really a chaotic time. And so that's kind of the height of the gender conversation. And I always tell people this, right? Like, it's fantastic that you're here and you're starting and your parents supporting you if this is what you're interested in doing. You've done all this work, you all have done all this work, and you're probably not gonna land on your feet for a handful of years.
3 or 4 years, potentially.
Yeah.
Depending upon when you start also, right?
Let's stop and see what our audience has to say. We've got another question.
The suicide rate amongst youth who are transgendered is shockingly high, especially when compared to the general population. How can parents and local communities best work to lower the rate of suicide among these children?
It's a tough question. Yeah.
Is it tough because you don't feel very hopeful about it?
No, not at all. I think it's tough because it's not 1 or 2 or even 3 things that contribute to the overrepresentation of trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary youth in these domains, right? That it is, people were like, yes, but they had, or he or she or they had a really supportive family, so why this? Or the school was really supportive, so why? And so people kind of reduce it down to a singular or 2 or 3 things, and it's much more complex because young people are not just existing in their parents' home. They're not just existing at school. They're existing in multiple spaces in real time, but they're also existing in this social political environment that we're all existing in, and not just like the current social and political environment, but we're always existing in a social political environment. And there are aspects of trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people's experiences that the social, legal, and political environment has been hostile, even in the times in which you would think it was the most friendly. And so we have to think about, like, from a macro, meso, and micro perspective on this topic.
It's so painful and it's so complex, like you're saying, and you know, there's been a lot of work done to look at the things that mitigate suicidality, suicidal ideation. There was a manuscript that came out this week about people who had the option to pursue puberty blockers when they wanted to had lower rates of suicidal ideation. And there's a lot of a growing body of work that looks at the correlation between parental support and suicidality, but it's really, people don't really understand the magnitude of the generational trauma that's been inflicted on the community. So people that are even 11, 12, 13 years old are also carrying the trauma of that was inflicted on the trans community in 1910. in 1935. And the stories as they roll down through the generations, it's a story of overt and covert violence, and that's very hard to overcome, even with supportive environments. Even if your school's supportive, your parents, your family is supportive, you're getting all of the interventions that you need, we still live in a cisgender normative society. And because of that, if you're a trans or non-binary person, you are experiencing covert and overt aggression.
So clearly we can't wait. Children are dying now. So where do we start?
I think it's important to talk about that. Yes, there are young people who are ending their own lives, but to not discount the amount of suffering that people who are still alive are experiencing. And I really feel very strongly that we have moved backwards in the last 3 years. We need to move forward. We certainly need to move away from this idea of precluding people from accessing medical interventions until they're 18. Just physiologically, our bodies have more hormone receptors when we're younger, and people are able to live a much more full and substantial, authentic life if they have access to services at a younger age.
And what about how it feels to be living not the gender that you feel you are when you're 14 or 15, if medical treatment is postponed?
The experience of gender dysphoria, and I think it's an important piece to say that there's a diagnosis of gender dysphoria that sometimes people think that is the entirety of that conversation, and really a diagnosis of gender dysphoria really is actually the beginning of a very lengthy, long, much more robust and detailed conversation. The experience of gender dysphoria is what people are seeing. They're not seeing the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and it's the experience of gender dysphoria that depending upon the environmental responses in that young person's own experience in that is what ends up impacting the trajectory of that young person's life of success, whatever that looks like for that person, or sort of like I'm struggling but I may still be able to make it, to the category of people who are like I'm struggling and I'm not going to make it, or I'm not hopeful that I can make it, right? And there are a million things that push people in these variety of different places, but I think that because I'm trans, I am able to conceptualize and communicate what gender dysphoria as an experience feels like in ways that can be a little bit more tangible sometimes for parents. And I think even my clients who are trans will be like, yes, no one has ever said it that way before.
So what is it that you say?
So it's a lot of chaos. It feels very chaotic. I do an exercise in the training that we do that is a very long training, where it's simulated what an experience of gender dysphoria is, gender dysphoria noise. And in the exercise, I wish I could do, but I will describe it because I think it will answer the question, is there's somebody sitting in a chair and they're meant to watch a video about science or some educational topic. And then there's 4 people standing around that person reading statements from a card to that person while they're trying to watch the movie. That's gender dysphoria noise. Those statements are things like, people know that you're trans, you're never gonna pass, don't go to the bathroom, they're gonna beat you up, you're not lovable, people can tell that you're wearing a binder, right? This onslaught of these violent statements. The thing is that those statements aren't always being told directly to that person. So it's what's really been said, but it's also the fear and the potential of what could be said. So gender dysphoria noise is based in what's happened, fact, but also based in what potentially could happen, which ends up being the story. But gender dysphoria noise can be treated, and there's aspects of it with intervention and with parental support and other very tangible things. You can chip away at some of that gender dysphoria noise. You will never be able to chip away and create an environment where that person has no gender dysphoria noise, because there's no amount of support or intervention that's going to make someone who's trans, whether they're a teenager, an adult, or senior citizen, not trans. Therefore, that there will always be accommodations required as a trans person to cope in this world that is not really set up for us, right? So the early intervention is a big part. But also validation. Like I'm all like, the social worker part of me is like, we gotta validate, right? If you have a trans kid or a kid who's gender nonconforming, or you suspect something is going on with their gender, right? That in that moment, your first stop on the train is not making an appointment with the medical provider. When we talk about early intervention, we're not saying like it's the first stop, right? There are many stops before the medical intervention piece, right? The first stop really should be what we talked about a little bit earlier of saying, thank you for telling me. I hear what you're saying. Like that moment, or going back and looping around and saying, thanks for telling me, I'm gonna respond different from here on out, whatever it is, that is the first step in protecting young people from arriving at a place of death. It's the first step.
Thank you so much for telling me and for telling us. And I hope we all now will be able to think more carefully to stop at validation. It's really such an honor to have this conversation with both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change.
Wow. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Aiden. Lots of questions, lots of comments in the chat. There are many about young children. And so I'd like to start with those, if that's okay with you. And I hope you'll interrupt me, Joe and Aiden, if there are some that you are really wanting to answer. So I'm going to read you a couple of them, and then you figure out where you want to go. There are a couple of general ones about how would you advise preschool administrators and teachers to support gender variant children both in their programs and with that child's family. And I think it's a pretty general one that speaks to many of the other questions.
Yeah, I think that going back to what we were talking about in our interview, the most important thing is that young people feel supported, right? It is true that there are many children who are gender diverse in their expression, who explore lots of different things. One of the beauties of, I always say this, one of the beauties of preschool is there's a dress up box, right? That people can have access to, and they can wear whatever they want. There are differences between children who have gender dysphoria, who have a gender different than their designated sex at birth. And those young people, and as much as I don't like to look at this through the lens of distress, the reality is that when parents talk about or describe stories of their children, they're not, my kid wants to wear a dress at preschool. It's, my kid won't go to school unless they're in girls' clothes. My kid is telling me that they wish they had been born a different, the kid's not saying a different gender, but I wish I'd been born a boy. I wish I'd been born a girl. I have heard more, let me just clarify for a second, back up. I work in a clinic that provides medical interventions and information and consultation for families with kids with gender dysphoria. I don't really provide consultation for kids who have boys that want to wear dresses. That's not where people are when they are seeking interventions. This is also really critical. There are no medical interventions for people who have not yet started puberty. That's just not what we do. Nobody who does that is practicing good medicine. And so for children, I'm talking about prepubertal children, there are some children that are experiencing a level of distress that drives them to have a social transition. And many, many families do this before they even set foot in a professional's office. They recognize that their child's functioning better, wearing different clothes and using a different name and maybe having different hair. And those are all reversible interventions. If those interventions are helping people do what they need to do as children, it's really important that we support them. We can talk to all children about the fact that there are some people with a gender that's different than the one that we might expect, or the one that everyone thought was their gender. We're not going to make people trans by exposing them to the trajectory of transgender people. We just open everybody's mind, right? This isn't, if you have a cisgender son, try to get your son to wear a dress to school, right? That will help you understand that you're not going to make someone trans who isn't trans. You're not going to be able to make someone wear the societally perceptive different clothing if that doesn't resonate for them or feel good for them. And that's really important to understand. I've often thought about this. People that are in preschool or 0 to 5, even earlier than preschool, if there were stories, if there was information that exposed people to the fact that there are many, many different trajectories of development, it would save a lot of heartache for kids who are trans, or even kids who are non-binary, or kids who are thinking about or talking about gender exploration. We're not going to make someone trans who's cisgender. We're just not going to. That's really important for people to understand.
Thank you, Joe. Aiden, did you want to add anything? Because part of this question was also about for preschool teachers, administrators, working with families. And there was another one from a mental health professional wondering about working with families where a young child is gender exploring.
Yeah, I mean, I will just add that I think that Joe is spot on, and I think that many of the things we talked about during the webinar are applicable to kids in a variety of different ages. You tailor the language to the age of your child, you tailor the language to the temperament of your child. Some children have a higher capacity to engage in conversations, and other children are like, oh my God, stop talking, I have to go do something else. And so you sort of tailor that. But I think that the number one thing that I really said this a lot in the video as well, is that if parents have support, if parents have mentors of other parents, they're just going to do a better job responding to these conversations. And so if you have a kid who is exploring gender, whether that is in their language or their expression or any, as parents, we have like we have senses of what's going on for our kids. So if you're a parent and you're like, something might be going on with my kid, engage in that support. Right now, support is so available because everything is on Zoom. So you can live anywhere in the country and certainly connect to the Los Angeles Transforming Family group, but you can have conversations. So if your young person's gender exploration continues to move in a way that maybe indicates they're trans, you're prepared, as opposed to I'm now in a panic trying to get some resources and information. I think at the end of the day, if we could just show up and meet kids where they are in that moment and not get ahead of ourselves and worry about medical intervention, 5 years, 10 years, surgery down. I mean, I think parents like cause chaos for themselves, and it's like, just stay in the moments. Be responsive to what your kid is saying right now. Don't worry about 5 years from now, because 5 years from now will happen either way.
That's super helpful. There are also a number of questions that I'm thinking of as being about culture and religion. So there was one from a home visitor working with first-time parents of children ages birth to 5 in a rural area where culturally gender identity is just not discussed very much outside of traditional Euro-American traditional male-female roles. And so it's just a question about advice, and is there a responsibility to discuss these topics, or only when a parent might be curious, or the parent can see the child is struggling with questions about gender. There are a couple other questions about how to use gender creative and non-binary language in a setting where Spanish is the primary language, where the language is gendered very specifically. And there's a question about supports for parents from the Chinese culture and community. And finally, one about the intersection of religion and gender diversity. So take your pick. There's a lot of interesting questions there.
Yeah, these are really great questions, and I don't have great answers for all of them. There are people who have devoted their careers to talking about trans experience and religiosity, and I don't have those references right now on me, but I'm happy to send them along. And so there are people who have spent a lot of their time sort of reconciling trans experience and Catholicism and Christianity. I'm not sure how much across other religions there are. But I can tell you also that the underlying tenet for most religions is love, and certainly love that extends to your family members and your children. And so I do think parents oftentimes are stuck in this position of, I've organized my life around this religion in lots of ways. It's my community, it's my second family. and am I risking losing this thing that I've, you know, constructed my whole life around in order to support my child? And I don't know that there's a great answer for that, but it's really hard when you start to have these positions that people take that are around, you know, the singular words, singular passages, singular sentences, right? It's very hard because that's a semantics argument, and it's usually it's being encased by someone who you're not going to change their mind. So that's not useful. But there are people who've done their life's work has been about addressing these singular passages and these singular words. And I think those are some very valuable resources for people who want to engage in talking about the intersectionality of religion and gender identity, for sure. There is, and I will also provide you with a resource for gender neutral Spanish. That's a very important one and interesting as well. I will try to dig that up somewhere and figure it out. But I think it's going to be really tough to change over a language that is very binary in the way that it talks about the feminization or masculinization of singular words that aren't even, you know, that may or may not, at some point they were related to a gender, they may or may not be now. But I think it's harder, and I think it takes just more words. It's just going to take more words in a language that doesn't have, it's not situated from a gender neutral perspective.
I just want to add really quickly. I know that we're out of time, or close to being out of time, I think, but I do want to add really quick that there are times in which people will remain in conflict between loving their child and the belief system of their faith or their religion. And I think too often it's framed where somebody has to make a choice. And I don't think people have to make a choice between. I think that there is a space that people can hold both, and both of those things can actually be in conflict, and they move forward and maintain healthy, loving, supportive relationships with both. We do that a lot. I don't have to provide a lot of examples, but I think that sometimes somebody being given permission, that acceptance can look a lot of different ways. Right? And that sometimes acceptance for somebody who has a conflict can say, there's a conflict. I'm going to hold the energy of that conflict. I love you, child. I'm going to be here with you, child. And I'm going to show up to my religious community and my faith and my belief system. I can do both, even if there is conflict between those things.
Wow, that is so helpful. You know, there was one, we are almost out of time. There was one question I regretted not getting to, which was in Spanish, about what do you do to help a father who's suicidal because of a child who is, where the suicidality is attributed to a child who's transgender. And I feel like you kind of both answered that question with what you've just said. There are lots of suggestions for resources in the chat, which we will save and try to extract them. And Joe, if you could send us those resources, we'll see if we can put them all together and put them on our Facebook page, because there's really a lot of hunger for this information. And you've both done such a beautiful job, not just for us today, but over the course of your long careers in helping so many people become enlightened and shedding light on this topic where there's so much misinformation and such strong feelings. It takes your brilliance and your bravery and your heart. And I'm really glad, Joe, that you ended up with love. I think that's a terrific place for us to sign off with. Love is love. Thank you all. And come back for our next Learning to Listen webinar. We're going to be focusing on some other challenging topics. We will be bringing in Mayra Alvarez from the Children's Partnership. She'll be talking about immigration policy and the effects of immigration policy on families. And this is coming up right before an election we think is going to happen. We've also got our webinar series on how to do the work that we do online, and we're learning together how to do that. We've got a webinar series on fathers and co-parenting. And in that series, we're super clear that we're talking about fathers regardless of their sexual orientation. So all you have to do is go to our brazelton-touchpoints.org webpage, click on the webinar tab, and you can register for these and many other webinars. Again, thank you so much, Aiden. Thank you, Joe, for being with us today and for the really important work that you do and the way you've supported so many children and families to just be who they are. As the article that just came out, I think today or yesterday in the New Yorker on transgender-rights talks about, and we've got the link to that in the chat too. Thank you everybody for joining us, and come back again soon. Bye.